Hello and welcome. My name is Miss Maxilene Despair,
And my name is Mrs. Ashley Taylor.
and today we will be walking you through the risks faced by nonprofit organizations. Here we have an overview of today's presentation. This is crucial information that you should know whether you are a member of a nonprofit organization or merely a person who interacts with that sector.
What is an NPO? Essentially, they are organizations formed for the benefit of the society or any class or part of society. NPOs can be formed as an unincorporated association or as a company. If an NPO is formed as a company, law does require that it must specifically be a nonprofit company. NPOs solicit contributions from the public or a section of the public within the TCI or elsewhere. A key point of an NPO is that no part of the income generated goes toward the benefit of its members, directors, or officers. Now that we have an overview of what an NPO is, what is terrorist financing? According to Section 2 of the Proceeds of Crime Ordinance, terrorist financing is willfully providing or collecting funds by any means, whether directly or indirectly, with the knowledge or intention that they are to be used or should be used in full or in part to facilitate the commission of terrorist acts, or to any persons or entities acting on behalf of or at the direction of a person who finances terrorism. Adaptability and opportunism shown by terrorist organizations suggest that all the methods that exist to move money around the globe are to some extent at risk. International typologies have shown the following. One of the ways in which terrorists obtain funds is through nonprofit organizations. Also, NPOs are used to raise, transfer, and divert funds for terrorist purposes. Finally, they identified terrorist organizations posing as legitimate NPOs.
Oftentimes we hear that NPOs are more susceptible to being used in the financing of terrorism. And FATF typologies show that NPOs globally have been exploited for TF purposes. But today, we'll help you to understand why NPOs are attractive for terrorist financing. We know that NPOs tend to enjoy high levels of public trust and confidence. We also know that they have access to considerable source of funds. And sometimes their operations may be cash intensive. We also know that NPOs can have a global presence, and this is not excluding areas where there may be conflict. We also know that NPOs can be diverse in nature, providing a broad range of activities and reaching all parts of society. And it's not uncommon for NPOs to have multiple donors and high volumes of small-scale transactions. With that being said, ultimately, we need to be able to vet the controllers of NPOs, and we apply a limited fit and proper test to do so. Here at the FSC, we need to verify that the activities of an organization meets the criteria to be an NPO and continue to meet that criteria throughout its existence. We need to verify that any exemption status obtained by NPOs should continue. And we need to collect data and information to maintain an accurate view of the risks in the sector to guide our strategies and decision making and determine the level of intensity of our engagement with the nonprofit organizations. We've talked about the why, now let's talk a little about the how. So how can NPOs be misused for terrorist financing? First, we see that this can be done through the diversion of funds. Funds raised may be diverted and used by the fundraisers to support terrorism. This can be done with or even without the knowledge of the nonprofit organization. This can become more apparent through transaction patterns. So if you realize that there are some irregular, unusual, or uncommon transactions, this can probably suggest some level of criminal activity. We can also note that NPOs can be misused for terrorist financing through the use of the NPO assets. Vehicles may be used to transport people, cash, weapons, or terrorist propaganda. The NPO premises may be used to store or display them, or even to arrange distribution. Another way that NPOs can be misused is through the use of their name and status. Through false representation, the NPO may be misused to falsely represent themselves as the agents of good works in order to deceive donors into providing support. And finally, some NPOs tend to fall victim to TF financing through abuse from within the organization. Persons involved in the nonprofit organization might abuse their position within the NPO for terrorist purposes, including skimming off money and sending or using the funds to support terrorist activities, or even for arranging or allowing the NPO premises to be used to promote or support terrorist activity or extremist ideology. Now let's go through some terrorist financing red flags as it relates to the NPOs. A possible sign of terrorist financing is when an NPO distributes funds to various recipients, this can be individuals or businesses, in a country that poses a high risk of terrorism. Another red flag is when the media exposes the NPO's connections to terrorist groups or actors that are involved or suspected to be involved in terrorist activities. It is also suspicious when the parties involved in the transaction, such as the account holder, the sender, the beneficiary, or the recipient, are from countries that are known to sponsor terrorist activities and organizations. Moreover, it is a cause for concern when large international NPOs based in high-risk countries send funds to their regional branches, which then funnel the money to local NPOs that operate or are located in domestic conflict zones.
What are some other terrorist financing red flags for NPOs? A major red flag is an NPO making unusually large cash withdrawals. More specifically, after a financial institution refuses to wire NPO funds overseas. Another potential red flag is a domestic or international transaction with an NPO that contains certain terms associated with violent extremism and other terrorist ideologies. It is also important to be aware of the use of NPO accounts that accept funds from suspected terrorists and their associates. This is usually based on law enforcement agency alerts on persons of interest. A potential indicator of terrorist financing is when an NPO collects funds from a large-scale public event and then delegates a third party to have access to the NPO account, who then transfers the money to high-risk countries. It is also a warning sign when an NPO sends funds to various recipients in a country that has a high risk of terrorism. This is something that should definitely be looked into. Another red flag is when the NPO provides vague explanations and insufficient documentation when the financial institution queries the NPO's request to move funds to these high-risk locations or entities. It is also suspicious when the transactions, whether it be a cash or transfer, involve key personnel of foreign NPOs that are linked to terrorist entities that are designated by the United Nations Security Council. Now let's put it all together. We have explained what an NPO is. We have also discussed what terrorist financing is and why it poses a serious threat to global security. Moreover, we have shown you how NPOs can be used for terrorist financing purposes and what are the signs of such abuse. Now, we will focus on the application of this information in the context of the TCI counter-financing of terrorism strategy and the obligations of NPOs under this framework.
The TCI's counter-financing of terrorism strategy was developed in line with wider international developments. Its key role is to combat the threat of terrorist abuse within the NPO sector. It's important to note that the TCI is an associate member of the Financial Action Task Force, also known as the FATF. This is through the Caribbean Financial Task Force, which is known as CFATF. The FATF establishes international standards for fighting money laundering, terrorist financing, and the abuse of nonprofit organizations by terrorists. These standards are expected to be met by all countries. FATF Recommendation 5 is a measure to help countries criminalize the financing of terrorism, terrorist organizations, and individuals involved in terrorism. FATF Recommendation 8 is a measure to help countries prevent abuse of NPOs by terrorist organizations. It requires countries to review the adequacy of their laws and regulations that relate to NPOs and ensure that they cannot be misused. Essentially, the role of the NPO supervisor is to make sure that the NPOs comply with the relevant laws. For example, the Prevention of Terrorism Ordinance 2014, the Proceeds of Crime Ordinance 2007, the NPO regulations, and such other ordinances, regulations, codes, or guidances relating to the financing of terrorism. The NPO supervisor is to ensure that the sector is kept abreast of relevant issues affecting them and to help guide their operations. Additionally, the NPO supervisor should be certain that instances of non-compliance are quickly and appropriately addressed, as this can be a contagion and definitely impact the entire sector. Finally, the NPO supervisor must offer support and guidance to help the sector operate in accordance with the law and best practices. Additional functions of the Financial Services Commission in this regard are to register NPOs, to apply proportionate risk-based supervision or monitoring to the sector, to monitor NPOs' compliance with the NPO regulations, to monitor the effectiveness of legislation relating to NPOs, including the NPO regulations, to conduct periodic reviews of the NPO sector, to undertake ongoing outreach to NPOs, and to take enforcement action against nonprofit organizations.
We have discussed the obligations of the NPO supervisor. What are the obligations of the NPOs? The first is all NPOs must be registered with the NPO supervisor. Once registered, NPOs have an obligation to file annual financial statements, accounts, with the NPO supervisor, in addition to filing an update form and personal declaration questionnaire when required by the NPO supervisor. In addition, NPOs must make, keep, and retain records of all financial transactions in order to evidence the use of application of the organization's funds, assets, and income. Kindly note the records must be kept for at least 5 years. They must also make, keep, and retain records of its purpose, objectives, and activities, the identity of key personnel, and the identity, credentials, and good standing of its beneficiaries and associate nonprofit organizations. NPOs are also obligated to report the following to the NPO supervisor within 14 days. Changes to the nonprofit organization's purposes, objectives, and activities, changes of office bearers and their addresses and other contact details, changes of the nonprofit organization's address and other contact details, and changes to the governing instrument. Finally, it is vital that NPOs conduct transactions via a regulated financial channel, know their donors, beneficiaries, and partners, be aware of sanctioned persons and countries, and inform donors of how and where their donations are going to be expended. It is very essential to report suspicious activities to the Financial Intelligence Agency, FIA. We are certain that you have gained valuable insight and guidance as it relates to risk faced by NPOs. We have identified best practices and strategies to prevent, mitigate, and manage these risks. We implore you to put into practice the knowledge you have received. We have also included additional resources on how you can ensure your NPO is better equipped from being misused for terrorist financing. On behalf of the Turks and Caicos Financial Services Commission, we would like to thank you for your time and attention and welcome any feedback or questions you may have.